Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 331. This week we are continuing our unit on democracy. So we're going to be looking at a paper today, The Right to a Competent Electorate by Jason Brennan. Let's get to work on Brennan. So Brennan is a defender of a view called epistocracy. So we're going to get clear on exactly what an epistocracy is. And we're also going to see that Brennan's argument rests on two important principles. One is called the competence principle, and the other is called the qualified acceptability requirement. And then once we have those two principles laid out, we'll be able to get a grip on Brennan's broader argument that he calls an argument from non-ideal theory. So, with that, let's get to work. So, Brennan is a philosopher who works at Georgetown and the University of Arizona. I believe that Georgetown is his primary appointment. And he's produced a number of notable works in political philosophy. So in 2016, he released a book called Against Democracy. The book was written before Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, but some people maybe started taking Brennan's arguments a little more seriously after electoral decisions were made, which, in their view, were unwise and arguably incompetently made. Brennan also does work on libertarian moral theory. So he's written a book called Why Not Capitalism, which is a defense of free markets, and also a book, Libertarianism, What Everyone Needs to Know. Just to get clear, Brennan is against democracy because he favors a view that he calls epistocracy. So, epis, or episteme, is a Greek term basically relating to concepts having to do with knowledge and belief. So the idea of an epistocracy is the idea of governance or rule by those who are the most knowledgeable. So Brennan's thought is that while democracy is all about rule by the people with universal suffrage, epistocracy is rule by the most knowledgeable, and there's going to be restricted suffrage. We get a question here, right? The question might be about whether restricting voting might be necessarily unjust. The thought would be, hey, Brennan, don't we think that rule of the people, by the people, for the people, isn't that kind of governance the best kind of governance? Isn't it the case that we do an injustice whenever anybody is kept from participating in the electoral process? So Brennan's response is not necessarily, right? And I think he makes a fair point in this spot. He points out that simply because voting has been restricted for unjust reasons in the past, so for instance, on the basis of the fact that in the past, sex and race were used as exclusions for certain people from voting, it doesn't mean that any restriction on voting is unjust. So we might consider an analogy here. It's in itself unjust to ban women from driving, right? But that point, in and of itself, does not mean that it's unjust to require a road exam to issue driver's licenses. Right? Just because it's unjust to restrict somebody from driving on the basis of one of the social groups that they belong to, that doesn't mean that universal unrestricted driving is the policy that justice requires us to adopt. So Brennan then points out that empirical evidence suggests that voters are often uninformed or misinformed. So within that context, we may well realize that many voters don't know what they're talking about when it comes to issues in economics and all sorts of policymaking. So to take the contemporary example, we might think that the opinion of experts is going to give us a better chance of preventing the spread of a deadly virus, experts with medical training, as opposed to the opinions of the masses, some of whom are woefully misinformed or taken in by conspiracy theories. So the thought is you don't find expertise within the public in general. And Brennan points out that this sort of lack of knowledge is an extremely predictable thing. After all, there are genuine costs involved with becoming more informed. In order to understand how economics works, you're going to have to spend a lot of your time at the library reading books, or you're going to have to take courses and what have you, and maybe even advanced courses to really understand which political party has the most defensible policy. So Brennan suggests that he wants to give a necessary condition for well-allocated power. So we're going to get into the specifics of the competence principle in our next slide. So then we can sort of try to start thinking about what makes incompetent voters in themselves an injustice. Well, here's Brennan's argument. He says that citizens have a right not to be subject to high-stakes decisions made by incompetent and morally unreasonable people. So the thought here is that the arbitrary power and force of others is something that we should be concerned about, and which in and of itself is unjust. Second, he points out that others' voting decisions have an effect on all our lives. Voting rights are a kind of power that we wield over others. And then last, he suggests that giving power to the incompetent and morally unreasonable cries out for justification. So the thought is, we have a right not to be subject to high-stakes decisions made by others. Voting decisions are high-stakes decisions. So we'd better have a damn good reason to give power to people, especially if voters have a tendency to be incompetent or morally unreasonable. So, one thing that Brennan sort of says is, we can all understand that being subject to the authority of another person cries out for justification, especially when we can recognize the incompetence in that person. So if we think about a terrible boss, somebody like the Michael Scott character from the television show The Office. The thought might be, there's something deeply unfair and something we should be uncomfortable about when we give massive amounts of power to people who are incompetent or, in certain ways, morally unreasonable. So, Brennan says that you probably already believe this. So he gives this point about juries. So he says that plausibly, juries that are ignorant, irrational, and morally unreasonable are ones that lack authority and legitimacy. So authority is about whether their decisions give you a moral obligation to follow those rules. Legitimacy is about whether the government has the right to enforce these things. So, like a moral right. So the thought is you have no moral obligation to follow the rulings of a jury that is ignorant, irrational, and morally unreasonable, and the government would be morally unjustified in enforcing such decisions. And insofar as, we have a right here, a right not to be subject to such arbitrary power, Brennan suggests that a principle can explain that right, and he calls it the competence principle. So the competence principle says it's unjust to deprive a citizen of life, liberty, or property, or to alter their life prospects significantly by force or threats of force, as a result of decisions made by an incompetent or morally unreasonable deliberative body, or as the result of decisions made in a morally incompetent and unreasonable way. So the thought is, if decisions are made in a way that is morally unreasonable, then it would be unjust to deprive citizens of things like life, liberty, and property on such a basis. And we can't point out in this case that juries in general are competent. So if yours is incompetent, or at least if you have a generally competent jury that behaves incompetently in your case, so let's say this is a jury that does not make racist decisions 99 out of 100 times, but it does make a racist decision on the 100th time, that 100th ruling is not a decision with real legitimacy. And Brennan points out it's hard to specify exactly what makes a view or a process of deliberation unreasonable. So he doesn't want to give a specific definition, but he says you can use your common sense notion of what the difference between a reasonable and an unreasonable view is. And says, whatever the fact of the matter is about what makes the difference between a reasonable view and an unreasonable view, we can plug this into the argument, and it's going to go through. We can also just use our common sense here that a jury decision that's made simply on the basis of, say, racism is not the kind of thing that would count as a case of reasonability. So, this competence principle is working as a necessary condition. If you're going to rule over others, you have to at least be competent. Now, Brennan points out that competence in and of itself is not a sufficient condition for authority and legitimacy. The thought here being, just because somebody is competent doesn't mean they have the right to force you to do something. So, for instance, just because a competent doctor tells you you ought to stop eating meat, that in and of itself does not give the doctor the right to force you to. But that's just the difference between a necessary and a sufficient condition, right? So competence is not a guarantee of legitimacy and authority. That would be to treat it as a sufficient condition. When we treat the competence principle as a necessary condition, we're saying that competence is a precondition of legitimacy and authority. So now that we've seen that the competence principle can be treated as a necessary condition for legitimate exercise of power, Brennan is going to argue that the competence principle applies to democratic decision-making. So he points out governmental decisions are imposed voluntarily through threats and coercion. He points out that these threats and coercion have a significant effect on citizens' lives. So the fact that the government forces you to pay taxes or requires you to educate your children is going to have a big effect on any particular citizen's life. And then Brennan points out, just like juries, voters, too, can be ignorant, irrational, and morally unreasonable in all sorts of ways. So the thought here is that if the ignorant, irrational, and morally unreasonable views of juries, decisions of juries, are things that we should nullify and not take seriously, why shouldn't we do the same thing in the case of democratic decision-making? So, moreover, Brennan points out that when our electorates are uninformed, that's going to cause the quality of our candidates to be lower. Sorry, I'm just getting my camera working again. Bear with me for 1 second. Sorry about that. So yeah, we have less incentive for high-quality candidates to do high-quality work and create good policy when you have a less informed voting body. And again, just like people being tried have a right not to be exposed to undue risk of those in power, the thought would be citizens under a government have a right not to be exposed to undue risk by those in power. And Brennan does argue that the right to vote is a kind of power. So if you have a very small society with 3 voters in it, then each voter has 1/3 of the power, right? And in larger societies, the number goes up, so the power is more divided. But we might worry, like, if we have somebody who is completely ignorant, irrational, and unreasonable, the thought would be, it makes no sense, and it's illegitimate to give power to that person, even a small amount of fractional power, to have a huge amount of control over your life. So Brennan is arguing here basically that if you believe that jury decisions can be irrational or morally unjustifiable for some reason, then you should also believe that their decisions should lack authority and legitimacy. But if you believe that about juries, why not believe that also about electoral results? So yeah, remember, we're saying that when we allocate power, a necessary condition on it should be that its decisions be made in a competent and morally reasonable way. So here's one possible objection. Somebody might argue that just because there are problems with universal suffrage, that is, giving everybody a right to vote once they reach adulthood, he says, the objector might say, that doesn't mean that it's just to restrict suffrage. Brennan responds, that's true, there might be some injustice in restricting suffrage. But he goes on and says that there might be certain injustices that are going to be inherent to any system of voting. And I'm actually even going to change my wording on that slide, or governance in general. So the thought here might be that any form of governance might have some injustice built into it. And then the thought would be, well, if any form of governance has injustice built into it, then we're going to have to do what political philosophers sometimes refer to as non-ideal theory. So it's a theory of comparing feasible but imperfect options. So the thought here is that when we do political philosophy, oftentimes we have to figure out answers to questions for an imperfect world, a world where there already is injustice, where people aren't going to listen to every single argument or be moved simply by reason, and where no matter what you do, some kind of injustice is inevitable. So then non-ideal theory is all about comparing feasible but imperfect options. So we're choosing among imperfect options rather than talking about what some sort of hypothetical perfect government, but one that would never actually come into existence would be like. So we're trying to weigh a bunch of different imperfect options. So Brennan's method in this context is going to be this idea of thinking about what kinds of problems there are going to be with restricted suffrage. And then he's going to consider whether those kinds of injustices are going to be worse than violations of the competence principle. So we're going to get a new concept. And this comes from the political philosopher David Estlund. And Estlund is in favor of democracy. And one of his arguments in favor of democracy is based on another moral principle. So we already looked at the competence principle. Now we're looking at a principle called the qualified acceptability requirement. So here's what the qualified acceptability requirement states. It suggests that any basis for distributing political power has to be acceptable to all qualified points of view. And when we talk about a qualified point of view, we're talking about a point of view of a reasonable, well-informed person. A person who isn't about to trample on the rights of others and who is responsive to information from the empirical sciences and economics and so forth. But we've got a broad thought here, right? And the idea is that liberal theory, so that's especially theorizing that's influenced by philosophers like Rawls, who we've already looked at in the semester, says that what we need to do in a proper liberal society, in a society that promotes freedom, is we need to find a way to tolerate reasonable disagreements. So the thought here is that within a liberal society, we're supposed to have tolerance between, and therefore rules that are acceptable to people who have disagreements about things like religion. So we need to come up with principles for living together, strategies for living together, that both Christians and Jews and Muslims and atheists would find acceptable. So when we find ways to distribute political power, we basically have to find a way to set up our system so that all qualified points of view will find this strategy acceptable. That's the idea behind the qualified acceptability requirement. And then Estlund argues that suppose we try to set up an epistocracy, right? What we're probably going to end up doing is finding some way to sort the competent from the incompetent. But Estlund objects that any exam that restricts voting rights is going to violate this qualified acceptability requirement, right? So if we think about everybody who should be considered a reasonable person, whose opinion matters, they won't be able to agree on a bright line that we use to make the distinction between somebody who is qualified to vote and someone who is not qualified to vote. So the thought here is that no matter how we set up the exam, some people who are in fact competent, that is, some people who have enough knowledge to participate in political life and do governance in a way that would generate legitimate results, some of those people who are competent will fail the exam. So the idea is we're worried about false negatives here, right? We're going to treat people who are actually competent as incompetent and thereby deny them the right to vote. So Estlund argues that that would be a violation of the qualified acceptability requirement and is therefore unjust, which is why we cannot actually set up an epistocracy. So, how is Brennan going to respond to this objection? Well, remember, we're doing non-ideal theory here. So the idea is that we need to choose the lesser injustice. So Brennan argues that, let's suppose that universal suffrage violates the competency requirement, right? If we let everybody vote, we're going to let some incompetent people vote. And moreover, that an epistocracy would violate the qualified acceptability requirement in the way that David Estlund has suggested. Well, when we're doing non-ideal theory, we have to remember that a perfectly just government isn't possible, so we have to choose the least unjust set of rules and policies among a set of options where injustice is always going to happen. So just like when we were trying to figure out how bad violations of the competence principle were, we thought about another case. We thought about the case of a jury that makes its decision on the basis of unreasonable or morally unjustifiable bases. Brennan says we can think about how bad violations of the qualified acceptability requirement are by thinking about other places where that principle is violated. And Brennan argues that current voting restrictions actually fail the qualified acceptability requirement. So he says that an age restriction on voting is a case where a sufficiently reasonable person is kept out of the democratic process, because what we do with an age restriction on voting is we say, yeah, age is an imperfect judge of how reasonable a person is. And then, we draw a bright line at 18 years old, 16 years old in some countries. And what we do then is we say, everybody on the one side of this line can vote, everybody below that line, anybody who's less than 18 years old cannot vote. And Brennan points out that there are going to be some citizens who are competent, right? So it will be unacceptable to certain qualified points of view, such as the qualified point of view of a very politically informed 17-year-old or 15-year-old or 14-year-old. So that's Brennan's big point, is he says that we see violations of both the competence requirement and the qualified acceptability requirement, but that violations of the competence requirement are more serious. So voting age laws and incompetent juries are both problems, but an incompetent jury decision and subjecting somebody to that incompetent jury decision is a bigger injustice than the fact that we don't let many savvy 17, 15, 14-year-olds to vote. And Brennan even says it's not about drawing the bright line in the right place, because if we really had to draw the bright line in the exact right place, it might actually be the case that we would have to let, 3-year-old child prodigies to participate in our political system. So the thought here, again, is limiting voting to the competent is just about as unjust as voting age laws. It's going to be imperfect, but it tracks something that is in general justifiable and that we reasonably care about. And allowing the incompetent to vote is about as unjust as following the rulings of an incompetent jury. So, within this argument from non-ideal theory, allowing the incompetent to vote is more unjust than restricted suffrage. So Brennan is not claiming in this paper that epistocracy is a perfectly just system. Instead, he's just saying that epistocracy is less unjust than universal suffrage for adults. So we'll just finish up with a couple of objections, and we'll think about how Brennan responds to them. One is this point that competence exams could be abused within this system. And, when we think about the legacy of voting rights in the United States, we might think about how competence exams were employed with the specific aim of keeping Black people from voting. And we might worry that manipulation by special interests is going to be a big problem if we were to readopt an epistocracy. Brennan suggests that insofar as that's possible, it's also possible that we could have incensed citizens fighting to make sure that these sorts of injustices don't happen. So the thought here might be, even though it's possible that there could be abuse and mismanagement when it comes to competence exams, we should also realize that it's possible that we might be able to keep them accountable in certain ways. And within that context, we should also note that universal suffrage also has the risk of certain kinds of abuse and unfair political game playing and so forth. One objection might be that we can't know the consequences of such exams. So we wouldn't know whether we could actually get better governance out of restricted suffrage. But Brennan says, even though he favors restricted suffrage in this epistocratic format, says we don't have to lay it out all at once, right? He said we could find less corrupt states. So I don't know exactly what Brennan's reasoning here is, but he says, like, maybe don't use a corrupt state like Rhode Island, and instead maybe we could institute this kind of policy first and experiment with it in a non-corrupt state. He picks New Hampshire. Again, I'm not sure about the specific evidence that Brennan has for those claims, but he's just making this broader point that this is the sort of thing that we could roll out over time, and we could see the results of it over time. We might also get this kind of objection in the form of an objection inspired by Edmund Burke. So Burkean conservatives believe that we shouldn't try to rewrite the way we do society all at once and all of a sudden, especially not on the basis of, we might call it philosophical fancies, right? Something that you just like think up in a chair and then say, well, like, that's how we should run society. Burkean conservatives say, look, present day institutions are there for a reason, and we should respect some of the wisdom that's built into those institutions. And this is kind of why Burke was against the French Revolution in both general and its specifics. Burkean conservatism suggests, like, maybe it's unwise to try to remake society from the ground up. But Brennan replies that epistocracy could be implemented without violating Burke's insight here, that we aren't trying to remake society all at once, even if we try to bring collective decision-making within the bounds of the competence principle. So that's going to wrap it up. So we've seen an interesting argument against democracy today. It sort of adds on to some of the similarly epistocratic proposals made by Plato and Richard Kraut earlier. So we're going to look at two short pieces next time. We're going to look at John Dewey's essay, Democracy, which is in your Kahn textbook. And we're also going to look at an interesting little essay by the writer C.L.R. James called Every Cook Can Govern, which is online. I've also posted a PDF of that on the course website. Okay, so I will look forward to continuing the discussion. Keep working hard, and don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions. Okay, thanks. Be well.